want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much. Welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, a podcast on the JFK assassination where we try to separate reality from fiction, which is something you see so often on the internet, particularly on YouTube when it comes to the JFK assassination. My guest in this episode is acclaimed author Gerald Posner, who has written 13 acclaimed books, including 3 that were on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list, Case Closed, Why America Slept, and God's Bankers. He's a contributor to Forbes. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History. His latest book is Pharma, which came out in 2020, which is an expose of the pharmaceutical industry. Gerald was a lawyer in New York City. You could reach him on his website, www.posner.com. And he also has a Substack where he writes frequently on a variety of topics, including the pharmaceutical industry and on the whole trans craze, which is something we both have something to talk about there at the end of this podcast. So welcome, Gerald Posner.
Fred, great to be with you. I sort of from the time you wrote I Was a Teenage Conspiracy Freak, I was always intrigued by your work, and then the amazing On the Trail of Delusion. It was just a fantastic work of original scholarship on the extent of how bad the Garrison investigation was. So we're a mutual admiration club here. I really admire your work on the JFK.
Well, thank you very much. And Case Closed was a book that really did it for me. I mean, I was sort of on the fence, and then I decided I had to buy a copy of Case Closed. But putting it off because everybody was nitpicking about a variety of things, and I said I have to read it. I went to the store. I was living in Oxford in the UK. Went to the bookstore in the center of Oxford. I knew they had a copy. I bought it. It sat on my coffee table for like a week or two. I didn't want to open it. I was scared. And I decided to open it, and I said, you know what? I'm going to skip the part on Oswald. I'm going to go right to the chapter on the medical evidence. And I read that chapter and said, oh my God, this is amazing. Everything in here is true and coherent and makes sense. And my eyes completely opened. And I said, there was no conspiracy. It all makes sense.
But Fred, it's very interesting when you say that you went right to the medical evidence. So in my view, and as somebody who delved into this and worked on it for a few years, the medical evidence, yes, and the ballistics and all is very, very telling. But all it tells you in the end is that one shooter at Dealey Plaza hit the targets that day, the target of Jack Kennedy, and then also wounded the governor. It doesn't tell you if there are other assassins at the Dealey Plaza who never fired a shot. It doesn't tell you who the assassin was. Right. It doesn't tell you, even if it does tell you who the assassin was, if they did it for their own. And that's why when you say you first skip the Oswald part, because for me, in an interesting way, when people say, what's the single piece of evidence that most convinces you it was a lone assassin, I sort of say the story of Oswald. Now, that's not an easy soundbite, and it's not something for people to grasp, but you understand it so well because it's really only when you start to understand Oswald that you get an idea for why this happened and why he was not somebody that any group of conspirators would have trusted very long to be part of it.
Yeah, and I think I was already convinced that Oswald was part of it, but once you realize that he was the only shooter, who on earth would work with this guy? I mean, it just doesn't. The whole thing doesn't make sense, And what do you think his motives were? What's your research telling you on his motives?
I think that's the great mystery that we sort of debate about and talk about because we never know, since he took it to the grave with him, thanks to Jack Ruby, unfortunately. And maybe even if he had lived and gone to trial and had been convicted, he still wouldn't have told us why. He might have done what James Earl Ray did after the King assassination and continued for decades to say, oh, it wasn't me, it was some mysterious other person who made me do it all. So maybe we wouldn't have found out even if he had lived. But
Right.
people want to know why. As an attorney, I get that in a criminal trial, if you're doing a murder trial, you don't need to establish motive to show the crime was committed. But juries don't like that. They like to know the why. For Oswald, my speculation, my informed speculation on it is that he had committed himself a few months earlier to political assassination for his cause of effecting change, this sort of odd mixture of left-wing Marxism with a bit of anarchy thrown in, this ideology that he had that he was the result of his own reading and having spent time in the Soviet Union when he defected, having studied what he thought were the sins of capitalism. And he committed himself to assassinating, as you know, not the President of the United States, but a retired army general who he thought was a right-wing threat, like in the form of Hitler in the 30s. He overestimated the extent Edwin Walker, this retired army general, might affect history. But to Oswald, he was a threat. Oswald tried to kill him in April, failed when the bullet was deflected along a window frame of Walker's house. Now, at that point, Oswald's already ready to make the move to effectuate political change through the barrel of a gun, as Mao would say. And later comes the opportunity of a lifetime for him. It's the President of the United States, the biggest possible machine to throw into the cog of the machinery of government. And for Oswald, it's an impossible opportunity to bypass. That being said, you will have a thought about this. I'd like to know what you think about it. There is the night before the assassination, which gives me some pause about his commitment to killing the president. And that is, he has to go outside of Dallas to a suburb where his wife, Marina, is living with Ruth Payne. They are separated, Oswald and his wife, at that point. He has to go there because his rifle, that is tied ballistically to killing the president to the exclusion of every other gun in the world the next day, is sitting in the garage of the Paynes, and Marina doesn't know it, nor does Ruth Payne. He has to retrieve that rifle and bring it in the next morning to the assassination, which he does disguised in brown paper bag as curtain rods. He tells the driver, his colleague who brings him in. That night, he has a long, heartfelt discussion that borders almost not really on an argument, but a plaintive pleading with his wife to come back with him. He says to Marina, let's get back together. We need to do this. He had a very tumultuous relationship with her. He had hit her at times. It had been violent. She had separated from him. He said, I'll buy you a washing machine. That was a big thing for him. They didn't have much money. They had a few $100s. And she said, I was so mad at him. I rebuffed every effort he made. I just kept saying no, 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 no. And later that night when they went to sleep, she later recounted that at one point she had rested her foot against his leg and he pushed it away with, she thought, ferocity, and she thought, boy, he's in a mean mood. The question that is impossible to answer, was he just faking it the night before? Was he pretending that he wanted to get together with her? Or if she had said yes, is it possible that the assassination of John Kennedy would not have happened, that he was what I called once an equivocal assassin, that he was ready to kill the president? People hate to hear that because they want to think this is a dedicated assassin. It's like this is like Sirhan, an RFK, writing down in a book, RFK must die, ready to kill him at any cost. That's not Oswald. He has tried to kill someone. He's ready to kill the president of the United States. I believe that when he went to Dealey Plaza the next day with his rifle, he didn't know what the security would be like. And let me tell you, if there was Secret Service in the building, it wasn't a suicide mission. He wasn't going to take the rifle out and try to kill the president. If co-workers of his had stayed on the 6th floor of the depository where he set up a sniper's nest, I don't think he was going to kill them and then kill the president. So there's an unusual phase here in which we expect zealots to be the assassins. He is a zealot of sorts, but there's a moment here in which he could have had a genuflection moment and backed away from the assassination. You may not agree with that, but
It's hard to say, I mean, I do think he was play acting a bit, but who knows? It's impossible. What I do find interesting is he left all that money for Marina on the bedside table, which he could have used for a getaway. I mean, I don't think he was even thinking of getting away. He didn't know whether he'd actually get a shot off. He may have also thought that if he did get a shot off, that perhaps he'd be killed, and that would be the end of it. So he didn't, he left all that money for her. So I don't think he was thinking about how to get away.
You're right. Well, that's a great question because he left essentially their life savings, right? Less than a couple $100s. And she didn't see that when she first woke up. That would have scared the hell out of her. She didn't see also that he'd taken off his wedding ring, which he never took off, and left in a little demi-tasse teacup that belonged to her. I think it was her grandmother. And that frightened her when she finally saw that. But he did take enough money. He had, and I forget the exact amount.
Like $13.
Right. Which was enough for getting on a bus that would have taken him down to Laredo, Texas, where he could have gotten a transfer to go back into Mexico if he was taking that route. We won't know, but I do not think that Lee Harvey Oswald, who at least had thought through the assassination in terms of waiting on the floor until all his co-workers were gone, setting up the sniper's nest so he was basically hidden from sight from the adjoining tall buildings on the 6th and 7th floor. They couldn't look straight into him. He wasn't taking the shot just as the limousine first turned the corner into Dealey Plaza, the straight-on shot that so many people say, oh, that was a better shot. No, it was the most exposed shot for him.
Yeah.
So he sets himself up at an angle to shoot at the car when it makes the more than 90-degree turn and heads away from the depository slowly. And he drops the rifle on the 6th floor, sort of throws it where he thinks it might be hidden for a moment. That has to be the case because he can't walk out of the building with the rifle. He'll immediately be tackled, arrested, and known as the assassin. He then has an effort to go somewhere. He gets in a taxi for the first time any of us can remember, right? He's very tight-fisted. He doesn't have much money. He gets out of the taxi. It's so slow, gets on a bus, and goes back to his rooming house to retrieve his pistol, runs into a Dallas policeman who thinks he's looking a little suspicious for whatever reason. We'll never know why since he didn't call that call in, and shoots him dead. Whatever he was planning, Fred, went awry at that moment. The moment he runs into Tippett. So Oswald he was clever enough at just turned 24 years old to have some crazy idea of how he thought he might be able to get away. And he didn't have, as you said, a lot of money. Besides the bus ride, it's not going to do a lot of wonders for him. So I do think he was headed out of Dallas, but I'll tell you, I have nothing to prove that.
Yeah, I think that when he actually killed the president, I think he probably thought, oh my God, what do I do now? And yeah, he realized he had to go back home and he had to get his gun. But I think he was walking around thinking about where do I go? What do I do? If he had that $200 on him or $170 that he left Marina, that would have not only gotten him to Mexico, but enough money to bribe people and actually do something quite substantial down there to really get away.
No, that's true. And that's why there's what I call unwarranted speculation, which means you're just picking it up out of the blue or you've just seen a TikTok video, and then sort of speculation based upon the history of how we understand him and what his limited options were. And as you just said, he had no option of going down to Mexico if that was his plan and being able to bribe officials with that. All he had was the ability to go to the Cuban mission and say, I'm seeking political asylum. You rejected me because you didn't think I was committed to the revolution. You turned me away here 6 weeks ago and wouldn't give me a visa, or the Soviets, but more likely the Cubans, and saying, you know what, I just struck a blow for the revolution. Now that shows you the extent of his naivety, because the Cubans wouldn't have touched him with a 1,000-foot pole, afraid that if they had any connection to the person who just shot the president of the United States, the entire island would be torched by the United States. So that wasn't going to happen, but that might have been his idea, that he could seek status as of safety at one of those missions. It's sort of like James Earl Ray foolishly thinking after he killed King that he wanted to get to White-run Rhodesia or South Africa, that those countries would give him safe haven. There was no chance that those governments, already ostracized in the world and under attack for being white-run governments, would allow the murderer, assassin of Martin Luther King, safe haven there and not extradite him back. But that's sometimes the assassins don't think it out very clearly for the aftermath to get away.
That's really very, very true. Let me ask you, given the fact that the evidence against Oswald is so overwhelming and so clear. What do you think of why the persistence of conspiracy theories today? How do you account for this? Because I mean, it just seems like conspiracy theorists, they 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 ignore, they try to explain, it's in fact, I think they're what really bugs me now about conspiracy theorists is that in the 60s, at least they used the evidence to try and convince you that there was something there. Now they claim everything is faked and phony, and that's their evidence of conspiracy. But how do you account for the persistence of JFK assassination conspiracy theories?
I think there is this psychological desire for a lot of people, and William Manchester, who wrote Death of a President, talked about this desire that you almost want to instinctively feel that there's more than just this 24-year-old loser in life, Lee Harvey Oswald, who managed to pull off the first real successful thing he ever did, and it was the assassination of the president. It just seems too big a feat, especially when the president is Jack Kennedy, and it means Camelot, and it's the best and the brightest and all of this. It can't be. And Kennedy had, admittedly, as any president has, but Kennedy had a lot of enemies, a lot of people that really hated him, a lot of people that cheered his death, I'm sure, within the mafia. His brother was going after them relentlessly, among pro-Castro Cubans who thought he was trying to destroy Cuba, a whole series of people. So I understand that that's easy to confuse and conflate and say, it couldn't have just been this guy, it had to be more. But what you said a moment ago, I think is so interesting. In the beginning, it's after the Warren Commission report came out in '64, even before that, conspiracy theories were more of questions about what had happened. The autopsy wasn't available. The public had not seen the Zapruder film. There were questions about did Jack Ruby have mafia ties? All of these issues. And those questions, there was even a book put out, Counterplot, by Edward J. Epstein, in '67 of that asked a lot of questions that have since been answered, but at the time were fairly good questions. There was also a knee-jerk response by some left-wing writers like Buchanan in Europe, some far-left writers, to say this is being pinned on a leftist at a time when it's the right who wanted Kennedy dead, so it must be a setup. All the evidence is overwhelming because they planted it all. All right. And then later people said, well, what is that thing with Dulles, the former head of the CIA who Kennedy had dismissed on the Warren Commission? We don't tend to think. And then the commission locks up the files at the request often of the Kennedy family for 50 years, and people can't see the material. They think that that's hidden. So I get that. And then the biggest thing that happens that guarantees conspiracy theories will never go away is what you ended up writing a book about, and that is that we had a public official and a district attorney in a major city that had a nexus. That city had a nexus to the assassination because Oswald had spent time there only months before the assassination, who said, by the way, there's this massive conspiracy, and tried to bring it to trial. And all the conspiracy theorists from Mort Saul, everybody else, they all went down and worked for him. Harold Weisberg, they worked for Garrison, they believed in Garrison. And when Garrison failed, they refused to believe the extent to which that was a fake prosecution. And I think at that point they were committed to it. They refused to give it up. And just at the point maybe when things could be dying down, in comes the House Select Committee, which does a tremendous job on debunking a lot of things. And then as they're running out of time, they get these sound experts in, Weiss and Ashkenazi from New York, who think, maybe on this tape that belonged to a motorcycle that might have been in Dealey Plaza, we hear 4 shots. And of course, you know what you hear when you listen to it.
Yeah, nothing.
Nothing. Right? They pick up supersonics. Turns out that's a minute and a half away from the assassination. It's not real. But at the time, it lets the Select Committee say 95% certainty of conspiracy. And boy, you're never going to change it. At that point, you're off and running. And so the theories are wild. They get wilder over time. One of my personal favorites, I liked him a lot. We had a communication. We could talk to each other, even though we never agreed on the case, was David Lifton's Best Evidence. The idea that the bodies were, the coffins were swapped. They had to do surgery on the president on the way back to the autopsy to make it look like he was shot from the rear. And this goes to show you the nature of conspiracy theories. I remember saying to David once, David, let me ask you a question. You've posited this theory in which a sort of secret team steals the body. They perform this intricate surgery to make it look as though the wounds are from the rear to frame Oswald. So when the autopsy is done, the evidence will match. very high risk operation with a lot of potential for going wrong. 2 caskets at Bethesda, all of this. If the two of us were planning the conspiracy to kill the president, we wanted to frame Oswald, and he's going to be behind the president. Why don't we just put the world-class shooter somewhere behind the president, in the Dow Tex building, in a neighboring building? That person will shoot the president from the rear, and then you don't have to do the surgery. You don't have to steal the corpse. You don't have to have the 2 coffins. You will have the wounds already from the rear where Oswald was, and you'll frame him even easier. Isn't that a much simpler, more straightforward, and less risky conspiracy? And he would have reasons as to why it wasn't. So I learned a long time ago, common sense and conspiracy theories, common sense doesn't necessarily push somebody off of a theory, a very convoluted theory they may have spent a lot of time developing.
I find it amazing that you take, even an easier way to get rid of Kennedy would be to leak all the intramarital, his affair with Judith Exner. My God, you're going out with the girlfriend of a mafiosi captain in Chicago. Boy, that's putting national security at risk. And Hoover finds out about it, and what does Hoover do? He actually puts an end to it. Doesn't leak it. He could have leaked it and destroyed Kennedy. No, he puts an end to it and says, don't do this.
Yeah, because Hoover was in the end a great collector of information. Hoover wanted the information in case anybody ever moved against him or he needed a favor or whatever else. The more information he had, the better he was. I did a book many years later on Ross Perot. He was a collector of information. Perot never used it, but he had it in case somebody moved against him. And so, those people like that are really sometimes can be the most dangerous.
And there were so many ways to really get rid of Kennedy. You could, and by the way, I spoke to David Lifton a couple of months before he died, because I wanted to ask him about this whole notion of General Curtis LeMay being at the autopsy. The conspiracy theorists claim Paul O'Connor had said. Lifton was the first guy to interview O'Connor, so I called him up in Las Vegas, and we talked for about an hour, and he couldn't really remember. He didn't remember O'Connor saying anything about LeMay, but I wanted to go back and check the tapes. He seemed to be a very sort of lonely man at that point. He at one point, our conversation got cut off because he was on a cell phone, and he sent me an immediate email, call me back immediately. And he wanted to talk about the book, Best Evidence, and the second edition, and this edition, and he was very proud of it, but he really wanted somebody to talk to.
David was an amazing person, a prodigious researcher. Tricia and I met him a number of times when we lived in New York, when he would come to visit his mother at a little coffee shop, a Greek coffee shop in the 60s off of First Avenue. And I remember he told us once, we said to him, are you dating anyone now? And he said, no, the last woman I was dating said, if you were as interested in my body as you are in Kennedy's, our relationship might last, but it didn't last. And so I think that was only half in jest. That was probably true.
And the one thing I really appreciate about David Lifton was he was one of the first people to understand that Jim Garrison was a charlatan.
Right.
And you could read his various writings, and that's what I appreciate about Sylvia Marr. She also really realized that Garrison was really ridiculous. If you go to the Sylvia Marr archive, which is now all online at Hood College, I've been going through it and reading all of her letters and her unpublished memos about Garrison, but some great writing about what she was seeing at the time. And it was very clear to her, and she was very, very distressed that so many conspiracy theorists just couldn't see it.
They couldn't see it, or as you know, they didn't want to see it, or they had this fallback of, even when they started to have internal doubts, they didn't say it publicly. They said, he must have something. He must have something, right? It's going to come up soon and save the day. And you mentioned Lifton. This happens to a number, I think, of people who buy conspiracy theories. They tend to rely on the accounts of eyewitnesses. Sometimes eyewitnesses who have changed their story dramatically over the decades. They don't look at the original accounts, or eyewitnesses who've inserted themselves, I use the eyewitnesses in quotes, into the story for their 15 minutes of fame years later. As an attorney, as an investigative journalist, I know that eyewitness accounts are very, very important, but you have to be careful about relying on them because eyewitnesses are often wrong. It's why at Dealey Plaza you get eyewitnesses and eyewitness accounts are all over the place. So one of the things that was the linchpin for David Lifton, and it's a classic case of how I differ with him on research or approach to a case, he had a witness tell him that he saw a wood coffin at Bethesda in the hallway, and there was a bronze coffin the president was put into. So that meant for Lifton, there were 2 coffins. And he then worked backwards from that into the amazing theory about swap coffins, swap bodies, everything else. If I had come across the eyewitness who told me he had seen a wood coffin at Bethesda, I would think immediately there's an account of the wood coffin and there's an account of the bronze coffin. One of them is wrong. I don't think both are right. So
Right.
my immediate feeling is, okay, one of those witnesses is wrong. Let me find out which is more credible and why. So his view is they both must be right. And that's where you get into real trouble, where you take every eyewitness account as being absolutely true. Like in Garrison's case, when you had all the instances of the witnesses who spotted Oswald wandering around with Guy Bannister, on voting registration and things like this. If you take eyewitnesses' accounts as accurate, you could get in a lot of trouble very quickly.
Absolutely, and most people haven't read Elizabeth Loftus's work on eyewitness accounts. I mean, it's really you see that in the medical evidence. I mean, yes, doctors at Parkland who worked on Kennedy frantically for 15 minutes. Yeah, I mean, their eyewitness accounts are going to be all over the map because they weren't paying attention to where the wounds were. They weren't doing a forensic examination, and they're just eyewitness accounts. The ARRB said in their final report, the only thing worse than eyewitness accounts are, 30-year-old eyewitness accounts.
Yes, that's absolutely right. But there's something interesting also. You can have an eyewitness account that recounts information that you've concluded as an investigator, as an author, is incorrect because you're able to show it from documents, photographs, x-rays, whatever else. Then you go back to the individual who's made that original account and you show them the material or you confront them with it. And the question is, if they still stick to what they saw, well, then they're locked into that story. But sometimes they have a reason as to why they said that. And the best example are the Parkland doctors. I interviewed in 1992 the 6, including the 6 from, Pepper Jenkins to Baxter to all of the main group that treated the president. And I asked them, why did you all end up saying in your statements that you thought the president had a front wound, which was later obliterated by doing, unfortunately putting the tube in and therefore once they do that and intubate the president, you no longer can see it. But by their eyewitness accounts, they all saw a front wound. And they didn't hesitate. They didn't say, I was wrong in that. They say, now we understand why we thought that. We never flipped the president over. We never turned the body over. So therefore, all we saw was a small hole on the very front of the neck, which we all assumed that's the entrance wound. If we had flipped him over and seen a slightly higher wound on the high rear neck shoulder area of even smaller diameter, then we might have thought, that's a straight through bullet. But we didn't know that at the time.
Right.
That makes perfect sense. And if you don't follow up and ask that question, I see the doctors still quoted. As you know, there was a documentary, just put out last year in which the doctors all say front wound, front wound, front wound, and they are never given, or it's never disclosed as to why they thought that and why they now have changed their mind upon reviewing the autopsy x-rays and photos.
Yeah, and when they were shown the autopsy x-rays and photos, they say, "Oh, yeah, that really is exactly the way it looked. There's nothing inconsistent." I mean, one of the favorite pieces I found was a statement that Dr. Berkeley had given to, I think, the HSCA, where he said, by the way, I saw the body in Parkland, I saw the body at Bethesda, and the wounds were the same. It was all consistent. Conspiracy theories will never quote that from George Berkeley.
And I've always thought, I'm surprised that there aren't more. And when we say conspiracy theorists, it covers a wide range. So it covers everybody from people who think there are 8 shooters at Dealey Plaza to people who just think it was Oswald possibly shooting, but in a plot with others are used. And I've always thought that the overwhelming, as you said, physical evidence, the eyewitness evidence, the ballistics evidence, the x-rays, the follow-up examinations done by the House Select Committee establishes without a question that the only shooter that hit the president that day was shooting from the general direction of the 6th floor of the depository, where Oswald was left 30 minutes before the assassination by his coworkers who went downstairs for lunch. Then you look at the sniper's nest and those fingerprints and the gun and Oswald's immediate escape as he leaves the building and goes on home to get his gun. And I'm convinced that Oswald's the assassin. The much tougher issue to answer is Was he doing it for himself, or was he motivated to do it for something else? That's always the harder part of the equation. But people who think it's a conspiracy get stuck in Dealey Plaza. They get stuck in the minutia of bullet angles and reflections and maybe the second shot and, oh, the single bullet, or the photographs taken in the backyard, on things that I think are important. You can't get to the case without it. A lot of chapters and chapters, as you know, just on the physical evidence on the single bullet. You need to establish that first. But once you get to Oswald being the assassin, then the real question for those of us who investigated is, okay, lone assassin or tool of a conspiracy? And I come to the conclusion, as you do, that it's a lone assassin for a whole bunch of reasons. But I've always thought that that is the area that I'd be focusing on if I was still suspicious it was a conspiracy.
Yeah, well, in fact, what I find funny is take Clay Shaw. You can go to all the JFK assassination boards, people who think that he might have been involved, but nobody really cares about his life. Nobody really cares about him. Nobody goes to the archives to go through his files. I mean, I have, but I mean, they don't care about Clay Shaw, but if they really thought he was a conspirator, they would be poring over his life, poring over all the financial records which are at the archives, but they don't really care. I'm struck by the fact that Garrison, whatever you say about Garrison, he investigated the JFK assassination for over 2 years, maybe 3 years in total. He followed every single lead he could find, and he found nothing.
Yeah,
absolutely nothing.
And of course, he had, a tool that no other researcher had, and that was the power of subpoena, power of the office. He was a prosecutor. I mean, he could really do things. He could hold the grand jury. He could have a trial. I like to say that the jury, I think that I say only a half tongue in cheek, that acquitted Clay Shaw would have been faster if they hadn't taken a bathroom break before they came back with the not guilty verdict. So Garrison failed to find it. Now, how do you leave the Garrison investigation believing in a conspiracy and convinced that somehow that investigation had some worth? You have to tell yourself that he must have found nothing because the CIA came in, penetrated him, and made sure there was nothing there. And all the embarrassing things that Garrison does, the overreach, the knowing it's a lie, going down the wrong path, intimidating and abusing witnesses, that's all set up by the CIA, and Garrison falls for it. And then he, later can be eviscerated by people like you, Fred, who write books about it. So, that's how you sort of think it's a grand plot. I get it. It's the same people who think that after Oliver Stone did JFK and Congress had passed the JFK Act and a whole new generation of people were convinced it was a conspiracy, that somehow somebody from Langley must have gotten me to write a book called Case Closed a couple of years later. Everything is tied into, I just always love how government, I was a poli-sci major at Berkeley, and I know my view of government is fairly ineffective and inefficient, even when it's trying to do something good. It tries to build a homeless shelter, and it's never on budget or on time or anything else. But when you get the nefarious wing of the secret government, they do everything at peak efficiency. No mistakes, absolutely perfect every time. And they don't leave one, unturned stone anywhere. And it may be in the movies, that's the way it works, but not in real life.
No, it's absolutely true. And by the way, I mean, you have Garrison working for 3 years, the House Select Committee over 2 years, the Warren Commission over 1 year. You've got at least 6 years of investigations into the assassination, and nobody found a conspiracy. I mean, it's just striking that you can't find one.
What is remarkable about it, of course, is in many ways that it makes sense today that among, let's say, generation, Z, millennials or that asked about the Kennedy assassination, they'll have no idea what you just said. How many official investigations, how many thousands of hours have been spent, how many eyewitnesses, how much evidence, how many experts, ballistics and film were brought in. All they know is maybe the Stone film, maybe they've seen the Zapruder film on the internet. And if you told them what you just said, Fred, about the number of official investigations, instead of convincing them, oh, well, maybe there's nothing here, would probably convince them that's evidence there is something here, because the culprit now is no longer, the Soviets or the Cubans or the mob. Maybe the mob did some, little work with Ruby, but it's the CIA, it's the government, it's the secret government. And to the extent that everyone thinks it's the government that's responsible for it, all these government investigations, of course you expect nothing more than a rubber stamp that says it was Oswald alone, because they have to follow the party line. So I don't think we would convince anybody with that.
No, no, it's absolutely true. I mean, I've always been fascinated. Well, first off, by getting back to Oliver Stone, I mean, you talked about the evidence here, and the evidence points to Oswald. It's funny that some people, sort of Oliver Stone, but Salandria and some others sort of want to go at the other end. I don't want to talk about all the ballistics and all the medical evidence. I want to go right to why he was killed. And clearly he was killed because of, he wanted to change American foreign policy. He was going to usher in a whole new world of peace and détente and rapprochement with Cuba. And so he had to be killed. And that's the evidence for a conspiracy. I don't have to go into the medical evidence and all that.
It's pretty remarkable. You're right. And look, I understand that when a public figure dies, whether it's Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, you don't know what they would have done in the rest of their lives, but you tend to fill in the rest of their lives in even a grander and better way. Nobody fills in the rest of their lives with them squandering every opportunity and becoming drunks and ending up in a halfway house. They think of them going on wherever they've been in their lives. They're going to do even greater achievements coming forward. And certainly that was the case with Jack Kennedy, this young, charismatic president, no doubt about it, fresh, this bolt of energy and technicolor in the White House after the Eisenhower years. And all the questions and problems that we then developed later in the 60s, like Vietnam, those issues, people like to think, well, that wouldn't have happened if Kennedy had been president. It's easy enough to say, we just don't know. You can argue it any way you want. I'm sure that there were people in the KGB and the Soviet Union that hated that president because he had a standoff with Nikita Khrushchev, and he won that standoff over the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were people in Havana that knew that somebody in the United States government, probably the CIA, was trying to kill Castro and had failed, and the president might well have authorized that. And even though he hadn't sent in the necessary reinforcements for the Bay of Pigs, they knew he was no friend of Fidel. And so there were left-wingers that wanted him dead, and there were right-wingers, John Birchers and others, who thought that he was too liberal a president coming, and they wanted him dead as well. So the idea that after he was dead, he never, that's the reason for killing him. Whoever kills him is doing it for sometimes an ideological purpose. I get that. It's not just revenge for the KGB or the Cubans. There is a reason to stop him in the future. But the idea that all of these problems developed, he was the president of peace, and therefore we can work backwards to understand that it had to be the government killing him, to me is just what I call circular reasoning. In logic, in high school logic and debate class, they would have been thrown out or given a D.
There was that Netflix documentary series about Robert Kennedy. And right at the end, they basically say, well, Robert Kennedy was going to usher in this whole new era of prosperity, and he was going to tackle Vietnam and tackle poverty and tackle this, and therefore he was dangerous and he had to be killed. And it was this sort of same argument.
It's fantastic because I think in some ways, and Bobby Kennedy's a perfect example, there's a need for producers doing a Netflix show or Hulu or whatever, Prime, to give it real meaning. And it doesn't seem serious enough to say, by the way, this was the first act of Palestinian terrorism on American soil by Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian who was killing Bobby Kennedy because he supported the sale of jets to Israel after the Six-Day War. That's the wrap-up. But it may not be satisfying. So, you think he was killed because he was also going to do a lot of future change. That sounds much more dramatic.
So speaking of RFK, do you have any comments on RFK Jr. and some of the statements he's made about the assassination?
Go on. I mean, Oliver Stone, I keep poking at constantly because I think he was so dangerous with the film. Great filmmaker, horrible history, and very bad at passing along his propaganda. Bobby Kennedy Jr., I basically leave alone because it's such a personal issue for him. I think he's completely wrong, but he's not doing it because he's a charlatan. He's not doing it because he's trying to create trouble or whatever else. That's what he believes. Other members of his family disagree with him. I think that he's far out on the edge there on, what he says about the CIA and everything else. It's demonstrably wrong, but it's a useless public debate to get into because you're talking to the son of the person who was killed, and he has a view of that, and he's cast it back to his uncle as well. So it's all part of a grand plot. And it's unfortunate. The one thing I agree with him on is, and the one thing I agree with Stone on, let's get the files out there. It's going to be late. It's not going to change many people's minds, but the files should have been out a long time ago. The more you don't have transparency on government records, the more suspicious people are, and the average person thinks they must be hiding something.
Yeah, and let's talk about those records. I mean, you've got like 3,500 to 4,000 CIA records. They've actually been released. They have some redactions. And that's, I think, a big problem. People think that they're hiding these documents, but no, it's been released. They have some redactions. Even Tunheim has said that there's nothing in there. He's seen it all. So what do you, I mean, I understand, there's 400 documents, I understand, that have redacted social insurance numbers of people who are still alive. I think that's actually quite reasonable. There might be a few informants who are named who might be still alive as well. But what's in these redactions?
Well, I mean, in the lead into that, you said something that was critical, which is we talk about it online, and those who think it's a conspiracy talk about it a lot and write about it, and we're inside baseball, so we know what's taking place. But when I have a discussion with somebody on the outside, I run into somebody and they say, "Oh, you're that guy who wrote Case Closed. What about those Kennedy files?" Right. And I say, by the way, they're just redactions, sometimes a single word, sometimes just a line, in files that have already been seen by the Assassination Review Board years ago before they were sent over. There's no smoking gun in there. You've left them at the train station because they don't know any of that. They think they're completely sealed files that nobody's ever seen. And one of the things is, you talked about the social security numbers of people who are alive. We also have in there the tax files of Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, one of the firms that he worked for in New Orleans. Those should be public record. We could take out some material. I think the CIA, in some cases, and we've seen this on what's been released in its entirety in the last few releases, is fighting over methods and means of operation that could at times be embarrassing to them on issues not even related to the assassination itself, but they were included as an assassination-related document. All of the organized crime files that were put in at one point might reveal informants. And I do think that it's possible, and we won't know this until the final files are out, that here we are, essentially, we're talking about this 60 years later after you could well have had a young 22, 23, 24-year-old asset in the federal police in Mexico City, a Mexican federal police officer at the time providing information. Maybe you had somebody working who was servicing and providing food or deliveries to the Cuban mission, young, who is still alive in their 80s. So I understand why that would be particularly material that they don't want released. Even in an instance in which you had a CIA asset who was providing information in Mexico City in the 60s, 60 years ago, if the family of that CIA asset is today involved in Mexican politics, the disclosure that a grandfather or father had been a CIA asset could have turmoil and effect in Mexican politics. So there are these side issues as well that take place. Nothing to do with who killed the president, but the fight over the disclosure of the documents. Yep. And I think that one of the good things about the JFK Act, when it was passed in 92 and said we're going to get all these files out in 25 years, and fell on the Trump administration in 2017 when they came due, is they said everything will be released that's related to the assassination in full, no redactions. We're used to getting the government files that have a name redacted, and then we sort of guess at who it is and figure it out of that. Here, the battle is they have to release them without any redactions at all. So those files held back with the single redactions, the line, the paragraph, they make it to the public sound as though there's much more. When they are all out, when, that's a great question. But when they are, if there is no smoking gun, it's not going to convince many people. They're just going to say, well, they had 60 years to get rid of the key documents. They had 60 years to bury the real one. They haven't turned it over. It's still hidden somewhere. So I don't think the final disclosures will make much of a difference.
And then they'll say, well, we never thought there'd be stuff in the documents anyways. But I mean, I saw I think John Whitten, or he went under the name John Skelsko. He was he was a person that was in the CIA at a very, very high level. And when he testified He testified before the HSCA, but you could read the ARB documents where he was pleading, don't make some of my documents public because I think he emigrated to Mexico or somewhere else. He said, I lied on my immigration forms because I was with the CIA, and if you make this public, it may put my whole everything at risk, And so,
Yeah, it's a great example. No, it's a great example. You're absolutely right. And Fred, also, I think there has to be, again, if you just have what I call a common sense discussion with somebody who doesn't know the details of the sealed files, but what I try to ask them is if they really believe that there's a massive conspiracy here and that the CIA was at the heart of it and other intelligence agencies, U.S. government, then I say, okay, so you think that you're telling me that the CIA managed to pull off essentially the perfect crime in Dallas in 1963. They fooled Fred Litwin, they fooled me, they fooled the House Select Committee, the Warren Commission. They've gotten away with it. No smoking gun, no bit of evidence that proves it was a conspiracy. But somehow, this government entity that sabotaged Garrison, whatever else they've done along the way, somebody made an error, and they sent a document over to the Assassination Review Board that found its way to the National Archives that's going to unpeel and expose the entire conspiracy. When they've realized that, instead they fought to keep it secret, but they haven't sent anyone into the National Archives, no secure zone, to steal the document back, to take it back, to do whatever. They haven't done that. So the mistake that they've made is they pulled off the crime, but they sent the document that exposes it all to the National Archives, and we're waiting for it to be released. If you really believe that, you have more faith in the ability of these plotters to mess up than I do. So even if there had been a plot, I don't think that we'd find the smoking gun document in this batch of documents in the archives. Now, that may feed somebody's conspiracy, but that's just my view of it.
We have a case right now in Canada. I don't know if you've been watching some of the interference claims. China's interfered greatly in Canadian politics. And there was a virology lab in out west where there were 2 Chinese spies working there. And there was a big investigation, and ultimately they were fired. But the government covered up all the files about what happened at that lab and telling the public, we can't release these files because of its national security. And ultimately, after a couple of years, they did release the files. And lo and behold, there was nothing there of national security. It was embarrassment.
Yeah,
The fact that they knew about this, they did nothing, they didn't care. It was all embarrassment.
It's the cover-up always that is the worst, because it does try to cover the embarrassment. There's a public television service, PBS show right now in America, and maybe in Canada as well, called Mr. Bates Against the Post Office. It's about the 20-year scandal in the United Kingdom, the post office. A 20-year cover-up. Why? To stop the embarrassment of the post office for what they had done with the computer system that was showing fraud that wasn't fraud at all. And even in the Kennedy assassination, as you know, I do think that what some of the early researchers, what maybe Harold Weisberg on his book Whitewash, or maybe Mary Farrell looked at, was what they thought was evidence of a cover-up. And I do think in the Warren Commission, it was lies from the CIA, or omissions, because they didn't want the Warren Commission to know about the plots to kill Castro. So they kept a close vest about what happened in Mexico City. They grudgingly gave whatever was asked for. And at the same time, the FBI, we know, was running as fast as they could away from Oswald to make sure that nobody could point a finger at them and say, oh, you, J. Edgar Hoover, the vaunted FBI, you had an open file on this guy? Yeah. You weren't investigating him a little bit more? So that made the Warren Commission look bad on some areas later. So I always say that, the cover-up was won by those institutions in both the CIA and the FBI to cover their own bureaucratic reputations, like you describe here on the instance in Canada with the virology lab and the inability of the government to admit what happened to the post office in London. So I'm not surprised that these agencies, when they're cooperating with the government commission, are also thinking, let's make sure there's no collateral and unintended consequence that comes back to bite us in the ass.
Yeah, and there's another, Jefferson Morley has brought up the case of, there's a memo written by Arthur Schlesinger in 1961 about the reorganization of the CIA. And it's like a 7-page memo. There's around a page and a half that's redacted. And the last release by the CIA, actually, in that redacted section, you could see the title of the section. It was about, controlled American sources. What does that mean? And so Morley is saying, oh my God, there's something really, really secret here, and this is why it had to, can't be released because the CIA, blah, blah, blah. Well, what I did was I went to Schlesinger's book, 1,000 Days, and I looked up the term, controlled American sources, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, there's like 2.5 pages in there where he discusses the problems of the CIA, exactly what he means. And of course, this was basically CIA personnel in embassies around the world who were not under the control of the State Department. So you have the redacted text. Okay, that's fine. There may be something specific in there, but you have this material that Schlesinger actually wrote himself describing the problem. So we know what it's about.
Fred, you're such a buzzkill. See, they're going off and looking at Schlesinger's own book to discover what he meant, right? I'll tell you, that takes all the fun out of speculating what could have been meant by one of the things, a lot of people like to focus on this turbulent relationship that JFK had with the CIA after the Bay of Pigs, and there's no question he did. And I often think to myself, the way the intelligence world works through a lot of mirrors, it's a hall of mirrors, right? It's hard to determine what happens. If they wanted to bring that president down, they wanted to mortally wound that president in terms of his reputation, they knew about the affairs, the Judith Exner affairs. They had the information. It might not have been an American newspaper that would have published it, but it might have been a French newspaper, right? In Le Monde. It might have been a British newspaper like The Guardian or the equivalent of that to break the news, and then the American press would have to catch up. They could have started a firestorm on this president. And that public firestorm, they can't control that, but that reaches a crescendo, and that would be different. There's nobody at Langley that was thinking about, oh, we should have to kill him. They wanted to ruin him. They had the personal information that could have been totally destabilizing. Now, that still would have been a crime. It still would have been horrific. You can't have the CIA releasing information that they picked up on a U.S. president of foreign sources. I understand all the reason that those people should be then in jail, but that aside, people, I think, often forget about that. They think CIA, Kennedy was hard on them. That must mean they killed him at Dealey Plaza.
Yeah, and I think it also points to the fact that these conspiracy theorists are so easy to claim treason. Oh, you didn't like Kennedy. Well, you obviously committed treason. Well, no, a lot of people may not have liked Kennedy, but they're not going to commit treason. There's lots of Canadian politicians I don't like, but I'm not going to commit treason against the state.
Maybe on any, Canadian prime minister as well, but on certainly every American president, there's probably some group talking at some point about, I'd like to get that no good SOB. There's some extremist group now. If somebody had, God forbid it, killed President Obama, are they anti-abortion people? Are they Islamic revolutionaries? Are they whatever? You have a group of people. In every presidential assassination, there are a number of hate groups and others that immediately come to the top of the list as possible suspects. Then you get the assassin, as you do with Sirhan or as with Ray or with Oswald. And the question is, did they do it for themselves or did they do it for one of these groups? So people get confused. They think that because X group, the mafia, the CIA, the KGB, whoever hated Kennedy, they must have been behind the assassination. No, they may have cheered it on. They may have been very happy that it happened, but you still have to have the old time causation. You need to have the connection. You need to show that Oswald did it on behalf of these people, not that he was just inspired to do it. And that's really where the failure is, because in my view, for whatever it's worth, the window for the connection comes down to literally about a 6.5 week period out of Oswald's 24 years. It's the period when he comes back from Mexico City. He goes down on September 25th when he's taking an overnight bus ride down to Mexico City from New Orleans. The White House announces for the first time publicly that Kennedy's going to make a trip in November to Texas. Nobody knows it publicly beforehand. So any idea of being a plot with the mafia, the CIA, whoever else, to have Oswald killed Kennedy in Texas couldn't have taken place before the White House decides they're going to send Kennedy to Texas. Oswald's trying to get to Cuba, goes to the Mexican and the Soviet missions and is denied. Nobody assumes, I've never heard anyone contend, Fred, that the Soviet officials and the Cuban officials who turned him down were part of the plot. So that happened legitimately. They really turned him down because they didn't want him in Cuba. Then the question becomes, when Oswald's dejected, comes back failing to get to Cuba in early October to Dallas, that's when a group of plotters would have to bring him into the plot. So from early October to November 22nd, where's the telephone call? We don't have text, we don't have emails, we don't have telepathy. There has to be some actual contact. The FBI looked through all the pay phones at the depository and near Oswald's house. They checked all the phone records coming in. His roommates who lived with him at the boarding house said he never had a visitor. He'd make a call every night or every other night in a foreign language. That sounds promising to you. Realize it was to Marina in Russian. So if you're going to establish that he was part of a plot, I've given you a narrow window, I don't mean you personally, but to a conspiracy theorist, there's 6 weeks you have to tie him into something, and they can't do it. They fail at every opportunity. And I don't think people realize that. They think of the conspiracy meaning over time, he could be brought in at any point. Even if he was an active KGB agent or CIA agent or Cuban agent, they still would have to activate him from October the 1st on when he went back to Dallas. Where is that activation?
Yeah, it's a very good point. What's your advice for somebody new coming into the JFK assassination? What's your advice for them, what they should do, what they should read, should they join this community at all? Should they avoid it and save years of their life, as unfortunately I did? What's your advice for a newbie?
I think read as much as you want with a dose of skepticism. Read Case Closed, read your book, read Vince Bugliosi's book, and be skeptical about it. Then read books about conspiracies as well. And don't be persuaded by the last book you read, but be persuaded by the evidence. Ask yourself the critical questions of how does the evidence stand up? You have to have an open mind. If you get into this field and you don't have an open mind, then forget about it. You'll find something that supports your theory. There's everything written about it. So if you just want a confirmation bias, you're looking for an echo chamber, you'll find it in one of the thousands of books that are published. But if you're looking to figure out what happened in the case, just be skeptical about what you read, but compare books, see what they say about the evidence, and be prepared to think or to realize that the conclusion you eventually reach may not be the most earth-shaking. Coming to the conclusion that Oswald alone killed Kennedy, I'm sure it's not what Random House wanted when I went back with my manuscript, right? They were hoping for something a bit grander than that. And it's a great story, as you know, because Oswald's an amazing character, but it's not, people are expecting nowadays grander stories. As a matter of fact, Fred, is a highlight in a book that I did a few years later on the King assassination. I conclude that Ray was the shooter. I opened up the door to the possibility that there was a small kitchen conspiracy with his brothers who have always denied any involvement in the crime, and maybe somebody who had paid him. And I thought, wow, that's really big news, because I thought it was Oswald alone without anybody helping him in Kennedy. And here I've got it's Ray doing the shooting, but a little bit of a possibility for conspiracy. But when I went out and would talk about that on the books circuit or that, people are very unimpressed with that. They don't think of that as a conspiracy. Conspiracy means to people from the 90s on big conspiracy, government conspiracy, X-Files. It doesn't mean a group of people around a table with family and somebody funding it. That they're not impressed by.
Well, it's funny because some people always ask me, well, do you believe in conspiracies? And I say, well, absolutely. Al-Qaeda conspired to bring down the World Trade Center. The Japanese conspired to bomb Pearl Harbor. They look at me like, no, that's not what we mean,
It's very, it is in fact very interesting. And of course, the Booth's assassination of Lincoln is a great case of a conspiracy. So, we do have them, and I understand that completely.
One last question on the assassination. I mean, is there any area that really is unresolved? I mean, the possibility perhaps maybe somebody egged on Oswald. The one unresolved area for me is the assassination files that are held in Moscow or Minsk, which might detail some of the KGB activities to convince Americans that the CIA was behind the assassination. Maybe there were other activities we don't know about. What do you? Is there anything left to learn about the assassination?
I think those files in Minsk will show the extent to which the early sort of questions and doubts and conspiracy theories about the CIA were fanned deliberately as a part of a disinformation program by the KGB, and they're excellent. They were excellent at doing that. And I would like to see whatever's left, if there's anything left that hasn't been destroyed, of the original files provided by the Cuban intelligence from their mission, because the idea of Oswald being egged on, there was a report never confirmed that he had said at one point, I can even shoot Kennedy. I don't think he said that at the Cuban mission, but it would be fascinating to find out what their original contemporaneous reports. They provided some of that to the House Select Committee, but it was cherry picked by the time it got there. And that would be fascinating to know. The other question that I've always just wondered about, which we may never get an answer to, is the same as 9/11. The CIA was following these two terrorists, Saudi terrorists that they knew about, who went to a terrorist summit in Malaysia. They had Malaysian intelligence, couldn't get sound on it, but take video of it. And they followed those two into the United States, into California, and in 2000, a year before 9/11 took place. And then they didn't do what they were supposed to do and tell the FBI. They're supposed to turn over to the domestic agency. And those two, Al-Hamzi and Al-Madar, went on to be on the planes on 9/11. They bought their tickets in their real names, hadn't changed them. They had California driver's license. It was a terrible story. So I'd love to know if the CIA picked up sound recordings or anything from Oswald or from their assets at the Cuban mission or the Soviet mission, to the extent that they had them, that would have indicated how off kilter he was, how potentially dangerous he was. And then when he came back into the United States, they just put him in the odd fellow, keep an eye on him in the future if he travels abroad, instead of telling the FBI. Maybe the result would have been the same, but it would have been a fantastic thing if they had some indication, not that he was going to kill the president, but that this is a guy trying to get to Havana, and he's saying things in these missions of being a good communist and everything else in the heart of the Cold War. Maybe we should tell the Bureau to up their case to a higher priority.
Right.
But that's what these agencies do. They develop information, they keep it to themselves. They guard it jealously. They never share it. This was the problem on 9/11. Now we hear they're sharing it better, and we'll find out if there's another attack, if they were sharing it better or not. Who knows?
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good point. Look, I'd like to end this up. Gerald, what are you working on now? What's your next book, and what's your current topic of interest?
Yeah, I have a couple topics of interest. I guess, I'm on fire about the, Trish and I have a small nonprofit called Anti-Semitism Watch that we thought a couple of years ago when we formed it, oh, this will be an easy task. We'll just be able to make a dent on anti-Semitism on campus. Little did we think that was a fire hose. So we could be doing that full time, and we're not making much of a dent, unfortunately, but we're working on that. And we're very on fire about this raging anti-Semitism, not only on college campuses, but worldwide. Also, I've been doing some reporting on the money behind what I call gender-affirming care, quote unquote, for minors 18 and under. I've written an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called "The Truth About Puberty Blockers," a couple of pieces in the New York Post about a whistleblower files from a transgender organization that sets the standards of care worldwide. It's a disgraceful story of experimentation and risk and harms that's playing out in real time. I believe one day that, this will sound like hyperbole, but I think that in 10 years, we may look back on this period of affirming children into the medical pipeline to make irreversible changes to their bodies without being able to give full consent, as great a medical scandal as lobotomies, which, remember, the doctor who invented that got a Nobel Prize for at the time. So medicine changes its view occasionally. And the last thing, Fred, is Trish and I are working on a book together that we're close, hopefully, to being able to find a publisher for. And it's the story about a Swiss financier who handled a lot of Nazi treasure after the war and was himself a dedicated pan-Arab nationalist, although he was Swiss. And he helps to fund, with Nazi funding and some of the remnants of the Fourth Reich, the early stages of Palestinian terrorism with the PFLP, Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PLO. He pays for the defense later of Klaus Barbie when he's taken back to France, the Nazi. He pays for the defense of Carlos the Jacko. We have information that he may have funded the Munich massacre. And so it's the birth of Palestinian terrorism on the embers of the Fourth Reich from these Nazis in Europe who thought, what, we failed in the final solution. But we think that these Palestinian terrorists who want a country and want to destroy Israel might be able to do it for us. That's the book if we can find the right publisher.
Well, I hope you do. I certainly want to read that. By the way, on gender affirming care, I mean, I've written on this as well. I agree with you totally. One aspect which really bothers me about gender affirming care is, in Canada we now have MAID, medically assisted suicide. And what worries me there is that the trend towards, affirming medically assisted suicide, so that if you want to get a doctor, you can easily find a doctor who will affirm your desire to commit suicide. And last year in 2023, we had 13,000 deaths due to MAID in Canada.
So now when Tricia, who's listening to this, who's sitting a few feet away from me, is going to say, "I told you so" to me, because she's been on fire about this particular issue in Canada and keeps saying to me, "We should write about that." And I say, "Tricia, we don't have the time to do it right now. We can't. Good Canadian writers are writing about it." But now I know she's going to hear that and say we should look at it, because it is really disgraceful. You're absolutely right. And as a lone researcher, as the two of us, it's you can't save the whole world, but these issues do get you, and I'll take a look. All right, maybe I can do a Substack at the very least on how outrageous it is.
Well, Gerald, thank you very much for appearing on The Trail of Delusion. It was a pleasure, and you are a treasure. I really appreciate all of your research, your journalistic expertise. You are amazing, so thank you very much.
Fred, thank you very much. Thanks for your great work on this, and I really enjoyed the discussion. It was great to have this chat with you.